So just so you remember, since you're muted, if you're going to jump in with a question, you got to unmute yourself because I won't know it. And don't be bashful. I do have a couple of places where it'll be open for discussion, but I really am totally fine with you interrupting me and jumping into the conversation. So last week we looked at Frederick Buechner. Tonight we're looking at Barbara Brown Taylor. And if you were with us, just a brief review that we've done a couple of times here, but we're really talking about saints not in the bygone days and the designation by the Roman Catholic Church, but really thinking more about what Elizabeth Johnson calls the Feast of Splendid Nobodies. That's her nickname for All Saints Day. So I'm defining saints here more in terms of people who've made literary contributions. So those are people that we could explore for ourselves, read their works, that kind of thing. So that's why I came up with these three. And last week, I ended by saying that when Buechner delivered his lecture in 1977, there was one person present whose life would be changed, and that was Barbara Brown Taylor. So there's a really great connection going on here. She wrote an essay, actually, and this is in a book called Buechner 101. And in this essay, she named it actually, Dear Mr. Buechner, You Rearranged the Air. So this is how it begins. I won't read all of it. I had been out of seminary for not quite a year in February of 1977. Not long enough to decide what to do, either with my divinity degree or the rest of my life. I was typing other people's letters for a living, helping out with the church youth group on weekends. I was single then, so there were also men who shall remain forever nameless, but my great love affair in those days was with language, with words, images, metaphors, and meanings. I had so much to say that I thought I could not say in church, fleshly things that were not religiously correct, melancholy things that seemed to betray the good news. So I wrote tortured short stories instead. I wrote poems so bad they made my teeth ache. When I received a flyer from Yale Divinity School announcing the Beecher lectures in preaching, I thought maybe that was the kick in the pants I needed. I did not know the lecturer, but that hardly mattered. I wanted to hear the clock on the quadrangle strike the hours again, see my old friends, maybe grab a beer at Archie's bar down on Willow Street. Still, I was paying attention when the dean introduced Frederick Buechner, the Beecher lecturer for 1977, whose lectures were entitled Telling the Truth, the Gospel as Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale. Great title, I thought, as the elegant man stepped into the pulpit. When he opened his mouth, I was struck first by the voice, restrained but insistent, as if he had something important to tell that he would not yell to make heard. Then the sentence structure, odd and looping, beguiling the ear. Before I knew it, he was conjuring up the living presence of Henry Ward Beecher, his predecessor by more than a century, the first Beecher lecturer in 1872. So now she's going to reference just a little bit about what Buechner said that day. Beecher had had a bad night, Buechner told us. With less than an hour to go before his first lecture, the famous preacher still had not decided what to say. Lathering his face to shave, Beecher was struck by sudden inspiration, dropped his razor, and dashed off to find a pencil with the suds still on his chin. When he returned to the mirror to finish shaving, he was so shaky that he nicked himself and drew blood. And then here's a quote. And well, the old pulpiteer might have cut himself with his razor, because part of the inner world that his lecture came from, among the clouds that it suddenly dawned on him out of, was the deep trouble he was in, or the deep trouble that was in him. The gossip about his relationship with the wife of one of his parishioners had left the whispering stage and was beginning to appear more or less directly in print. A public trial for adultery was not far off. It was not just his reputation and career that were in danger, but in some measure the church itself, everything he believed in and stood for and had come to Yale to talk about, end quote. So now we're back to Taylor. Less than 5 minutes in, Buechner had already given me blood, a bad night's sleep, self-doubt, and an illicit affair. Mon Dieu, the ragged private truths of a well-pressed public preacher. Were we really going to speak of such things in church? I had never heard anyone go so directly to the heart of the matter, nor use language to get there so movingly. As the lecture continued, I was slain in the spirit, though still propped up in my pew. I was known through and through, though my name was never called. Dear Mr. Buechner, you rearranged the air. And I don't think it's much of an exaggeration. Hopefully you could follow all that. The Beecher lectures, Buechner is referring to the original one with Beecher, and Barbara's telling it. But I really don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it's hard to know what her future would have been apart from that, because this was a very telling moment. She, as she said, she was typing other people's letters. She was actually working at Candler School of Theology as a secretary there, and had a divinity degree, but was trying to figure life out. And this really made a difference. So it seems kind of poetic that we would do Buechner and then Barbara Brown Taylor. So here's a question for you. What do you know about Barbara Brown Taylor? I would say it's fair to say that, as with Buechner, she's quoted by preachers all the time. There's probably people sitting in the pew that go, I don't know who she is, but I hear her name all the time. And as with Buechner, she's admired by scholars and laity alike. I mentioned last week that that's a pretty rare combination. There are people who write who can get the attention of two of those three groups, or one of those three groups, but very few get all three. So what do you know about her, her story? What have you heard or read by her? So this would be the time to unmute and impress me with whatever sticks in your brain.
An altar in the world.
Can you say more about that? What is that?
It's a book. It's
Okay.
a book that she wrote, and it's one of those that you can read and reread and reread and never get the whole thing. It's excellent.
Thank you. Someone else?
The first time I ever heard of her was when they reviewed a book of hers on NPR. I haven't read it, but
Do you know how long ago that was, or what book?
Couple years ago.
Okay. Was that
we listened to her sermons and her interviews frequently at Faithbook. She is just so interesting, and her idea of other religions and love are just phenomenal.
Speaking of that love, one of the quotes she had in one of the interviews we saw was, Jesus did not command us to love our religion.
Yeah, that sounds like Barbara.
And it went on to say he commanded us to love God.
Yeah. Someone else? So we've exhausted everything you know about Barbara Brown Taylor already, huh?
She lives out in the country.
She lives out in the country.
She's Episcopal.
She's Episcopal.
Well, sort of.
She's married to Ed.
She is married to Ed.
And Glenn mentioned her repeatedly.
Oh,
Quoted her in sermons.
yeah. She makes cameos in pulpits all over. Well, I don't think there's a Sunday that her name doesn't get mentioned somewhere.
I like some of the cards that when you're trying to find a card that you, a thinking of you card, then she has some of the most wonderful things that if I look long enough, it absolutely hits the spot.
It's great. Yeah, if you're ever looking for quotes by anybody for that matter, I don't know if you've ever used this search engine, but if you go to Goodreads, you can put in the name of an author. You could put in quotes by Barbara Brown Taylor and go to Goodreads, and they'll bring up just hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of quotes.
Well, I'm a little embarrassed that I can't come up with specific things that she said, but every time we've heard one of her lectures or sermons or anything, everybody in the whole group is always sort of transfixed. Nobody's ever said that I know of anything negative. She just really knows how to talk and to make you feel like you're learning something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking up, I just typed in Barbara Brown quotes, and one of them, the first one that popped up, it says, every human interaction offers you a chance to make things better or to make them worse.
Mm.
Her class that she taught and talked about in one of the lectures, or whatever you want to call it, was when she was giving an introduction to religions, and what she put the students through that broke them out of their comfort zone was very interesting.
Mm. Yeah. It's really funny because the way this is set up, you see the PowerPoint and you see me when I'm talking. I assume you see whoever's talking when they talk. But mostly what I see is that picture of Barbara looking at me. And I can imagine her saying, okay, enough of this. Let's get on with it. There must be something more important to talk about than me. So let's dive in. Barbara Brown Taylor was born in 1951. She is still alive, thanks be to God. So I'm going to give you some highlights. She would love me selecting this picture, by the way, because this is where she lives now, but it fits really well with her upbringing. As you may or may not know, she was born and raised in rural Kansas with a love for nature and land. She was baptized as an infant in the Roman Catholic Church. Her dad was Roman Catholic, and so she was baptized at 5-6 weeks, something like that. But the family really didn't attend church much growing up. Her mom was Methodist, though. She was from the South. And Barbara's attraction to God began to take shape when they moved to Ohio. And specifically, something in particular happened. The Methodist minister there took a liking to her and her love of nature. And so one Sunday, he said, I want you to sit up front. And he used her as an example in the sermon. Now, he didn't have her stand up or anything like that, but he referenced, I know this girl who loves God and loves nature. And the attention that she received from that, from the minister, was a really big boost to kind of her spirituality. I mean, she was a spiritual young girl, but you can imagine the impact that that would make, that here was a minister who cared about her. Here was somebody affirming her love of God and nature. When they moved to Alabama, she visited an Episcopal church, and this was at age 12, and she fell in love with liturgy. Now, she didn't become Episcopal then. It was just part of her kind of what I would call flipping through the yellow pages, you know, from one thing to another. But she does comment on how at age 12, you know, kind of in this puberty stage, that she felt like not only were there hormones, but there was a kind of spiritual hormones going through her. And she was really very much in tune with God. She attended Emory University, graduating from there in 1973. And I'm going to backtrack just a little on this because it's while in college that she had, and I originally had put a conversion, but that wouldn't be accurate. And it's kind of hard to explain what exactly happened. I just put religious experience here, but here's what happened. One afternoon when I was a sophomore in college, of course, we know that was Emory, I was sitting in my dormitory room, minding my own business, when someone knocked on the door. I opened it and found two young women clutching Bibles to their breasts. My heart sank. With my parents' help, I had avoided organized religion most of my life, and these two, with their gleaming eyes, their earnest faces, their modest plaid skirts, and sensible shoes, these were just the sort of people I'd hoped to continue avoiding as long as I could. The Holy Spirit had sent them, they said. Could they come in? While I was thinking of a suitable reply, they did come in, and I was a goner. They sat down on my bed, opened their Bibles, and began to ask me questions. Are you saved? One of them asked. Well, I said, that depends on what you know, the other one said, writing something down on a pad of paper. Do you want to be saved? The first one asked. And both of them gleamed at me while I thought how awful it would sound to say no. Sure, I said. And they leapt into action, pulling me down to sit beside them on the bed, one of them reading selected passages of scripture, while the other one drew an illustration of my predicament on her pad. Here you are, she said, drawing a stick figure on one side of a yawning chasm. And here is God, she said, drawing another figure on the other side. In between is sin and death, she said, filling the chasm with dark clouds from her pen. Now the question is, how are you and God going to get together, she asked. I don't have a clue, I said. And they both looked delighted. Then the one with the pen bent over her drawing and connected the two sides of the chasm with a bridge in the shape of a cross. That's how, she said, Jesus laid down his life for you to cross over. Do you want to cross over? Sure, I said. And the look in their eyes was like one of those old cash registers where you crank the handle and the little sale sign pops up. Then they told me to kneel by my bed, where they knelt on either side of me and instructed me to repeat after them. I accept Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior, and I ask him to come into my life. Amen. Then they got up, hugged me, gave me a schedule of campus Bible study, and left. The whole thing took less than 20 minutes. It was quick, simple, direct. They did not have any questions about who Jesus was. You are here, God is there, Jesus is the bridge. Say this words, you're a Christian. I admired their courage in a way, but nothing they said really affected me. Most of it was just embarrassing. So interestingly enough, though, listen to this, I'm skipping a little bit. After they left, I went out for a walk, and the world looked funny to me, different. People's faces looked different to me. I'd never noticed so many details before. I stared at them like portraits in a gallery, and my own face burned for over an hour. Meanwhile, it was hard to walk. The ground was spongy under my feet. I felt weightless, and it was all I could do to keep myself from floating up and getting stuck in the trees. Was it a conversion? All I know is that something happened. I may have been fooling around, but Jesus was not. So, when you look at her life, the trajectory, and a lot of it depends on your theology of the order of baptism and confirmation and infant dedication and all of those things, which are big differences between different traditions. Like she said, it's hard to know what to call that. My hunch is, in hindsight, what she would say is that it's not a conversion any more than a conversion happens over a long period of time, but maybe one piece of a long conversion. But it's an amazing story that she basically said, yeah, just to go along and not hurt their feeling, and then something powerful happened. She majored as a result of that in religion, attracted not by philosophy and theology so much, but the ethicists on campus. They were having some heated discussions about Vietnam, also abortion, Kent State, all of those kinds of things, as well as nature and her love of God. So she graduates with a degree in religion, has no clue what to do. Well, she enrolled in Yale Divinity School in the fall, right away. Actually, what she did was two things. One, she applied to Yale on what was called a kind of trial year. She also applied to Harvard grad schools to think about doing master's and PhD and teaching. But she got accepted into Yale and didn't get accepted into Harvard. And so she ended up at Yale, and then she started visiting churches, and that's when she actually found a home in the Episcopal Church. And it was really the liturgy, the beautiful prayers in the book, etc. And then, of course, we read a moment ago, she returned to Yale for the Beecher lectures, hearing Buechner, and that had a tremendous impact on her. It's a little bit fuzzy, really, the order of it. And if you read it, pretty much, everything she's written about it, Like a lot of us, the memories kind of get jumbled up, but that, along with her work at Candler and the relationship with people there, started to make a difference. So she started working in a downtown parish, Episcopal parish, until she pretty much nearly had a breakdown. The senior priest there, the father, he, it was just a busy time, and she wasn't thriving in doing that, and she wasn't thriving and living the life. I mean, if you look at this picture of her, this is her thriving, and this inner city church with these ungodly hours were really just killing her. So she and Ed moved to Clarksville. So Ed's an engineer, but he could do that pretty much anywhere. And so there was a time, actually, I can't remember if I have a reference to it or not. I think I might have a reference later. I'll read to you, but they were both just kind of tired of the city, and there was this fire engine that went wailing by one night when they were on a walk, and he said something like, "I'm going to die young if we don't get out of here." And she loved the country, and so they moved out to Clarksville. If you've read her memoir, Leaving Church, it's a pretty funny story. She decided, well, okay, I'm going to get a parish out in the country. So they started taking drives out of Atlanta on the weekends just to kind of look. And they happened one weekend into Clarksville, where there was this little bitty Episcopal church. Nobody even in Clarksville hardly knew where it was. And she said, "That's where I want to go." And the next thing you know, the minister who was there died. And she instantly thought, "Oh my gosh, did I wish this on this guy?" But it all worked out, and she ended up being there for quite a few years. She left that church in the early 2000s to become professor at Piedmont, and it's rural as well. Now, the move there is documented in her memoir, Leaving Church. And a couple things you need to think about here. One, there were some tensions within the church that she was dealing with that were hard, because it's a very small rural area and everybody knows everybody. And so while they loved being in the country, she no longer had any anonymity, and there was just a lot of lack of privacy. She also was becoming more and more popular on the circuit. And so it was hard for this church to always have her gone. And then the other thing that happened was she kind of started to feel this need to teach, and was becoming more interested in world religions. And so that had grown over time. And all of it came together when they approached her and said, "Would you like to teach?" And it fit very well. I will say this, Leaving Church, her memoir, was very misunderstood. And you could probably look online at reviews. I remember when it came out, of course, I read it instantly. And a lot of people said, "I can't believe she's leaving, the church." Well, they didn't mean Clarksville. They meant she's leaving Christianity. And I knew right away that that wasn't the case, because at the very same time, she and David Bartlett, who had taught at Yale, were editing a 12-volume series called Feasting on the Word, which is this great commentary for preachers. And I was invited to contribute to it. Well, you don't edit a volume of commentary for preachers if you're leaving church and leaving Christianity. She was leaving that parish. She was going to teach, but she also was starting to broaden her horizons beyond just Christianity and church. So I think that would be a fair way to say it. And she recently retired, but continues to write and do some preaching and lecturing, although not much. I did try to get her a year or so ago, maybe 2 years ago now, to come to Country Club, and she just much more comfortable not doing that right now. So I want to just kind of put a little bit of her in perspective for me. Some of you have heard me, last week I talked about this, minor poets and major poets. So the pastor's minor poet means that they rely on major poets. So people like Brueggemann and people like Barbara Brown Taylor. These are major poets for preachers. And you may have heard me say before that I think preaching can be summarized in 3 words: what and how. And my mentors or major poets in how sermons are put together are Fred Craddock, Gene Lowry, and Tom Long. That's the triumvirate of homileticians in the late 20th century. But my mentors and major poets in what sermons might say, in other words, the people who really influenced my thinking and what I have to say, would really be primarily Frederick Buechner and Barbara Brown Taylor. It's not to say there aren't others, there are, but those are the 2 people in particular, along with the 3 above, that have influenced me. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how Barbara and I became friends. So in the early 90s, I was teaching at a seminary here in Kansas City that was being taken over by the fundamentalists. And, you know, I'd gone to seminary and gone through PhD to teach, and had finally done that, landed a teaching job. And now it was all coming unraveled. And I was terribly depressed. So I'd gone to the annual Academy of Homiletics meeting, the Academy of Teachers of Preaching at Duke. And we were in the divinity school, but we worshiped in the chapel there, which, as you can see, is just breathtaking. And it just so happened walking back that, and it's, I don't know, quarter mile or something, walking back, she and I just fell in next to each other on the sidewalk. And we didn't know each other. I mean, I knew who she was, but she didn't know me. And we started talking, and she could tell something was wrong, and I spilled my guts. And then I was just shocked when shortly after getting home, she had written me a really nice note, which I have kept. And we started corresponding some over the years. And because of that connection, I was able to host her for preaching lectures. Remember last week I said I tried to do that with Buechner and it didn't work. Well, it worked with Barbara. And so I entertained and hosted her when she came to lecture. This was about the time that she had made Baylor's Top 12 Preachers, which got published in Newsweek. And by the way, she was the only woman on the original list. And when they recently redid it, and I think did 20 or 25 this time, she was still the only woman on there. But I remember her saying to me, it's the worst thing that ever happened. Because in the car, we were going to eat at somebody's home. It was a generous person that supported the seminary. And I said, hey, I saw you made the top 12 preachers. And she goes, yep, worst thing ever. I said, well, why is that? She goes, okay, imagine you're sitting on the chancel. You're getting ready to preach. And someone gets up and introduces you and says, you're getting ready to hear one of the best preachers in the country. She goes, nobody can live up to that. So I thought that was funny. Several years later, early 2000s, I was the visiting scholar at the College of Preachers, which is attached to the Washington National Cathedral. And I was there for, I think it was either 4 or 6 weeks. And she was there for a week during that, doing a workshop. And so we got to spend some time together, and I attended her workshop. And I was working on the book Fully Live Preacher. And so when I presented, I thought it was great serendipity. And I said, hey, would you be willing to write the foreword? And she did. And so that was a really nice thing. And then a few years after that, we happened to be in Boston for the Academy meeting, or maybe it was for the Society of Biblical Literature, but we both ended up at a Thanksgiving service in Boston at the Old South Meeting Hall, which is a very historic, patriotic site. Deval Patrick, the governor, read scripture. Peter Gomes, the great preacher from Harvard Memorial, preached. And as we were leaving, we ran into friends, and we all went to eat Chinese and talk books, and it was a great treat. And then just more recently, we met up at the inaugural Buechner workshop where she was speaking, and ran into each other at this wine and cheese reception. And I remember her saying, I'm so nervous about my speech. This is Princeton. And I said, Barbara, they're just people. It'll be fine. You're Barbara Brown Taylor. It'll be fine. So I've been really fortunate to get to know her, and I hope that you get a chance to. But one of the ways you can get to know her is reading her. Like Buechner, she's authored different types of genres. So Always a Guest is one of her most recent books. It's a collection of sermons, and she writes an introduction about what it means to be a guest preacher all the time, which I can tell you from experience is a very unique kind of thing. She has nonfiction. I just put the one Learning to Walk in the Dark. She has memoir, Leaving Church, and then lectures. And this one, When God is Silent, is her Lyman Beecher lecture that she gave. And I'll read just a sample here in a minute. But she hasn't published fiction. And that's an interesting story because she wanted, and you heard it, she wanted desperately to be a writer, to write fiction, but nobody would publish her. And I think that's another one of those things that it's good for us that she didn't. If you go to her website, this comment is bold front and center. I say things you're not supposed to say. Now, I take this to be a response to critics, especially in two areas, and we heard a little bit of reference to this. The fleshliness of our existence, flesh and blood. She does not back away from that. And that God is not bound by church or even Christianity. People that I have great respect for and who were good friends with her, they kind of gave up on her. They thought she was going down the wrong road. And so she's always kind of pushed the envelope a little bit when it comes to those kind of things. I can't remember. Let me see if I have this. Yeah. So here's my recommendation, though. If you want an initial exposure, or even if you've read a lot but haven't read An Altar in the World, Marilyn mentioned it, I would recommend this one. I think it's a really good smattering of her. I think it also is approachable. Its chapters are short. They all stand really on their own. She kind of does it by practices. And she has these two that, if you think about it, very much fit with her spirituality. The practice of wearing skin. Remember, we were just talking about the kind of fleshliness of life, and the practice of walking on the earth. She cares about nature. I love this story, though, and this is the beginning of the chapter on the practice of wearing skin. Once, when I was a guest speaker at a church in Alabama, I decided to take a look around the sanctuary before the service began. It was a grand old Episcopal church, circa 1920, with Tiffany-style stained glass windows and a striking mural of Jesus emerging from his tomb over the altar. Since I was a good 45 minutes early, I had the place to myself, except for a member of the altar guild who was polishing silver in the sacristy. She was the kind of woman who helped me feel inadequate simply by being so pulled together. Clothes were expensive. Every hair on her pretty head was in place. I could see her manicured fingernails flying as she polished the silver chalice with a soft gray rag. "Hey," I said. "Hey," she said. This is how we greet one another in the South. "Hey there" is a common variation. Anyway, I'll skip. "Hey," the perfect polite woman said. Then she went back to polishing silver, and I went back to checking out the church. And so she leans in for a while, and then I'm skipping a little bit, she goes, and the woman, the pulled together woman in the sacristy said, "It's beautiful, isn't it?" This painting that she was looking at of Jesus. "It surely is that," I said. "But did you ever notice that he has no body hair? He has the underarms of a 6-year-old. His chest is as smooth as a peach." Her manicured fingernails stopped moving at the smile froze on her face. "I can't believe you're saying this to me," she said without moving her red lips. "I just can't believe you're saying this to me." So here was a woman who was, and there are lots of people who are uncomfortable with the fleshliness of Jesus, as well as perhaps their own. But that's the kind of thing that has always, I guess you could say, gotten Barbara into trouble. But she kind of relishes that. So a couple of samplings I thought might be helpful, and then we'll have a little discussion here in a moment. This is from Speaking of Sin, which is a nonfiction work. And so it's a thematic book. I have at least two related concerns about the language of sin and salvation. The first is about how difficult it is to speak in mainline churches today. Second is about what we may lose if we forget how to speak it, because a language is not just a collection of words easily replaceable by any other language. A language is a particular community's way of making meaning over time. It is shaped by that community's experience of reality. It is loaded with that community's values. And she writes, goes on to talk about these words that really don't get used much anymore. So skipping back, she says, when I say sin, there is no telling what you see. The stolen candy bar, the rumpled sheets of a bed you shared with someone else's lover, a large pipe spilling orange sludge into a once blue river, a clutch of homeless people sitting around a fire built from trash in a vacant lot between two corporate skyscrapers. The picture will be different for every one of you, but the experience to hunt for is that one that makes part of you die. So you can hear there not only just her theology, but her love for beautiful language and words. She is an excellent wordsmith. And if you picked up a copy of her lecture, which, by the way, Becky told me is in the well, that along with, now I forget which one it was. I think it was Altar in the World. So this is, if you'd happened to been at Yale when she gave the Beecher lecture, the book itself is dedicated to Fred Craddock, but here's how she began her lecture. How shall I break the silence? What word is more eloquent than the silence itself? In the moments before a word is spoken, anything is possible. The empty air is formless void waiting to be addressed. Depending on what is said, earth could be all ocean, a blue water world in space. Adam could be a self-regenerating monk who sleeps alone by the glow of 2 moons or 3 and has to make his own decision about the fruit of that one beguiling tree. Anything is possible until God exhales, inspiring the void first with wind and then with the word, which is both utterance and act, which makes something out of nothing by saying that it is so. God says, and the Logos yields the cosmos. And the whole book is just absolutely stunning. I required my students to read that in preaching class. And then if you picked up her memoir, notice the epigraph she has is from Faulkner. The only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. And I think that fits very well. I'm not going to read you the excerpt about her and Ed deciding to leave, but this is at the very end of the book. In the 21st year of my priesthood, I empty the bag of my old convictions on the kitchen table to decide what I will keep. The clerical collar I once wore like a wimple is brown where it is rubbed against my skin. My human dirt has come off on it, and I've lost all will to bleach it clean. I wear it very seldom now, both because the plastic band bites into my neck, because it draws more attention than I want. I love watching people, which becomes far more difficult when they're watching me. Street clothes are good camouflage, and my gray hair is enough to get me a seat on the subway without changing the way people talk when they see me. Since I still serve as a guest preacher some Sundays, I will keep the collar. The neckline of my cassock does not stand upright without it, and the jolt I receive when I see it in the mirror tells me that I'm not through with this mark of office yet. So you can see how even there, I mean, she was still owning her priesthood. If you picked up a copy of Sermons, this one just happens to be from Home by Another Way. It's a great story. This is simply the way she starts this sermon. Once upon a time in a land far away, there was a kingdom called Georgia, not the one I'm from, but one tucked into the Kashgar Mountains east of the Black Sea between modern-day Turkey and Russia, where wild geraniums carpet alpine meadows and the sound of waterfalls is everywhere. 1,000 years ago, it was Camelot, rich in everything that mattered, including the love of God. And she goes on to describe how it's in ruins. but she comes across this what's the word? Not a mural, but a fresco of Jesus that's in ruins, and he's only got one eye, and she describes the church under repair. So it's very poetic. And by the way, not exactly fiction, but she more recently ventured into writing a children's book by that name, Home by Another Way, which we actually referenced a little bit back in Advent. And then I thought might be good for those of you who've not heard to hear Barbara Brown Taylor, if I can get it to work. We'll see. We'll just hear a few minutes of this.
Will you pray with me? Come, Holy Ghost, our souls inspire and lighten us with your celestial fire. For if you are with us, then nothing else matters. And if you are not with us, then nothing else matters. Be with us, we pray, in the name of your beloved. Amen. Grace to you and peace in the name of God's beloved, and thank you for your warm welcome to Riverside Church. I have not been hugged so much in a long time. I've been here many times through the years, sitting where you are now, and I have received a blessing every time. So today it is my turn to try and find some good news you can use in the text before us, which sounds very different the morning after last night. Full disclosure, I am an Episcopalian. We preach very short sermons. So if you have not had enough when I am done, you raise your hand and I'll start all over again. Most of you know the story you just heard again so well that you can tell it by heart, because it is heartwarming and tender and true that we are all called to help the hurt stranger in the ditch, that we are all called to assist God in the healing of this world. The problem is that anyone who loves this story has probably misunderstood it. That's easy to do, since it is sometimes told as a self-congratulatory tale about people like us, Christians, I mean, who knew the right answer to the question Jesus asked the lawyer, even before Jesus told the story to back it up. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? Answer: the one who showed him mercy. We have gotten the lesson of the Good Samaritan so well that we have named hospitals after him, neighborhood clinics, relief agencies, job centers, nursing homes, and credit unions, completely forgetting that he never was and never will be one of us. He was the enemy. He belonged to the other side. Shortly before Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, Luke says he was refused lodging in a Samaritan village. His disciples had gone ahead of him to find a room for the night and came back to tell him that they would all have to keep walking, because Samaritans did not like Jews any better than Jews liked Samaritans. The two groups had enough in common to disagree about who was right about God. They both followed Torah, though not the same version. They both worshiped in a temple, though not the same one. They both claimed to be God's chosen people, though neither would admit that God might have chosen more than one chosen people. Each group viewed the other as a bunch of vile imposters, unclean in the eyes of God. A Samaritan did not want a Jew sleeping in his bed any more than a Jew wanted a Samaritan sleeping in his bed. So it's unlikely that Jesus was surprised when his disciples asked his permission to call down fire from the sky to burn that village up. They were that angry with the Samaritans, but Jesus told them to get over themselves. That's not how you deal with rejection. The way he dealt with it was to tell a story in which the Samaritan was a hero, a neighbor, the one who showed mercy. First, he reversed the circumstances, putting the Samaritan in Jewish territory, where it might have been hard for him to find a bed for the night. Then Jesus made the Samaritan the good guy, the foreigner who saved the life of a man whose own people had let him down. Maybe it was wishful thinking on Jesus' part.
Okay. So it's only a few minutes of it. You can go online and listen to all of it if you'd like, but any comments about that sermon or any of the incredible amount of material I covered prior to that? It's a lot to take in.
Mike, I suspect that maybe Becky was saying what was in the library, and I know that we have several of her books, including the children's book, in the well, and we will, when we reopen the well, have even more.
Yeah, good.
Along with the Buechner books.
Yeah, I'm so excited that, yeah, Becky said we have 10 Buechners in the library and 2 of Barbara's. And I'm so excited for us to get back and to have a library and to have the well and be together.
I confess that it's probably only been in the last 2 years that I have become aware that the Samaritans and the Jews were anything but strangers. I didn't appreciate all of my life that they were fierce antagonists with each other. And so she's exactly right. I misunderstood that whole parable for 72 years.
Yeah. Yeah, the Samaritans pretty much in the middle of the country. And so what we would call Israel kind of surrounded it. And to go from the north to the south, you would go through it. But Samaritans were a group that were formed out of the exile. You remember when the Babylonians and the Assyrians attacked, they took people off. Well, some of those they married into these others, and so they became half Jews in the Jewish scheme of things. And so there was a lot of resentment about that.
Mike, has she always written books, or did she start writing after she started after she left preaching?
No, she had written even while she was at the church. She published sermons. She published a book called The Preaching Life, which really kind of put her on the map with preachers, because she has 4 or 5 chapters up front about call and vocation and so forth, and then has some sermons, and that kind of put her on the map. But yeah, she was writing and publishing. But see, that was another reason for her to move too, was there was just so much, to do in the parish, whereas the university would want her to write and would support that.
The altar, Carla did a class a number of years ago that I took, and I think some of the others here took, on the altar and the world, a several-week class reading it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's a great book.
I remember Carla talking about learning to walk in the dark. And apparently she went to some kind of a several-day seminar or kind of out in the woods kind of thing, walking in the dark. And
yes, I remember.
so I bought the book.
Yes, I remember Carla mentioning that. Yeah. Anyone else? Well, I'll just remind you before I do a little lead into next week that my whole perspective on doing this Saints of Our Time is these are great companions on the journey. You know, they are for preachers, but they are for everybody. I mean, Buechner and Barbara Brown Taylor, they have stuff that's addressed more to clergy, but they have so much that's addressed to everybody. And they're such great writers and thinkers. So I hope that you'll, put them on your wish list. If you got a birthday coming up, you can put them on your leave a link to Amazon for your spouse that's called Hint, Hint. Okay, so leading up to next week, Brueggemann has, when he did the Beecher lectures, his was called Finally Comes a Poet, and he uses a line from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. After the seas are all crossed, as they seem already crossed, after the great captains and engineers have accomplished their work, after the noble inventors, after the scientists, the chemists, the geologists, the ethnologists, finally shall come the poet worthy of that name, the true Son of God shall come singing his songs. And I quote all that just to bring up the point Brueggemann makes, and that is that in a time of turmoil, that's when we need poets. There's so many examples throughout history of poets speaking a meaningful word in a very hard time. And the other image comes from the movie Contact, when Jodie Foster's character kind of starts to make this contact and is coming into contact with an emerging galaxy. She exclaims, "They should have sent a poet." So I think in times of despair and in times of beauty, we need poetry. And so we're going to consider the poetry of Mary Oliver, which that's a great picture of her. And I'll just say up front, if you're one of those people who's allergic to poetry, like you in school didn't go well, trust me, Mary Oliver, it'll go well. This is a very different poetry than perhaps comes to mind when you hear the word poet or poem. So we'll spend some time with Mary Oliver next week. All right, any last words for the good of the cause? Stop sharing. I can at least see your faces.
Thank you, Mike.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for being here. Everybody, I hope you're well.